Welcome, everybody. I am the director of the European Studies Center. My name is Othon Anastasakis, and I've got the pleasure of chairing this wonderful panel today. It's great to see you all in a full room. And this is the first of our seminars in our Tuesday European Studies Center seminar series. It's great that we're starting with a very, very good topic, with a very good panel, and with a very good discussion. I'm sure that you will all enjoy and participate. Now, the topic that we are discussing today is understanding right-wing populism and what to do about it. So this is the publication here that Team Vlandas and Daphne Halikiopoulou did together, and for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation. And it's a very, very rich report on a very topical subject, and very topical for our days in Europe today as well. Let me just very briefly introduce the speakers, and then we can continue with the discussion. Now, we'll start with Daphne, right? You're going to be the first speaker. Daphne is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Reading, and from January, will be the chair of political science at the University of York. So congratulations, Daphne, for that. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And Daphne has done her PhD at the London School of Economics. She's one of the foremost experts on the issue of far right, extreme right. She's written extensively. Indeed, she wrote her book, which was called The Golden Dawn Nationalist Solution, explaining the rise of far right in Greece. I was very happy to comment on this book at an event at the London School of Economics. And next to Daphne is our very own Tim Vlandas, who is a fellow of St. Antony's College. And he's with us here at the European Studies Center, but also Tim is an associate professor at the Department of Social Policy. He's worked very closely with Daphne on various occasions on the issue of far right, and he does political economy of Europe and welfare politics. Both of them have also got awards for their publications in journal articles. Then we've got our other very own, Lenka Bustikova, who has just arrived from the United States, and she's our new associate professor of EU and East European politics at the Department of Politics and International Relations and OSCAR. And Lenka has also written extensively on the extreme right as well. Her book, Extreme Reactions, Radical Right, Mobilization in Eastern Europe, has actually also won an award. And we are very, very happy to have Lenka in general here in Oxford with us, because she's a great addition on matters that we all care for. And last but not least, Anja Giudici, who is a lecturer in education at Newcastle University. And I understand that you've written a lot on education and the far right, and involved also in a project that was looking at education ideas and strategies of post-World War II Western European far right. And with that, I'm sure it's going to be a tremendous discussion. Let's start with Daphne.
I'm going to be standing.
Well, all right. It's not enough to say no to in this context. I think there's a couple more chairs on the first row. I could go down.
Yes.
So, hello everyone. I'm so happy to see such a full room. So, thank you for coming, and thank you for your interest in our report. Thank you for the center for hosting us, Othon for being the chair, and of course Lenka and Anja for discussing the report. So, please. So Tim and I are going to actually be alternating. So we're going to be going a bit back and forth. But I will start this presentation by giving you the bigger picture, the so-called rise, or what I'd like to call the sort of mixed success of the far-right parties across Europe that we're covering in this report. Second, we will be presenting our argument, which in a nutshell, and maybe a bit controversially, is that the success of these parties is not solely and exclusively a cultural issue. It is actually a multifaceted issue and also has to do a lot with economic insecurity. Third, we will present our empirical analysis, which is at 3 levels: the demand side level, so what we call the people level in the report, so what kind of voters support these parties. Second, the supply, so this is the party level, what types of rhetoric and discourse these parties put forward. And finally, the policy level, what kind of policies might be helpful, helping us to address this phenomenon. And then we will conclude. So before I do any of that, Othon did hint at the fact that Tim and I have worked quite a lot on this issue. So we just want to give you just a very, very brief starting point to say that this is not, this report is not a new thing at all for us. It's actually the culmination of 10 years almost of collaboration. And it has also, part of this work has also been published in academic articles. In a nutshell, we do, let's say, again, 3 things. We look at the demand level in some of these papers, looking at the different types of insecurities that drive voters, focusing specifically also on economic insecurity. I should say here that when Tim and I started working, we brought together our two sort of diverse areas of expertise. We brought the political economy side from Tim and then nationalism/voting behavior from me. We looked at the supply side, so the type of nationalism that these parties put forward to attract voters, and then our indeed award-winning article on how particular social policies help limit the insecurities that drive people to support the far right. But let's give you the bigger picture. I guess if I ask everyone here, what do you think is going on with the far right today? Most people will say, well, yay, it's really on the rise. This is indeed the case, but we do want to highlight very quickly both the rise, but also the mix, the variation across different cases, because what is really interesting is the different patterns across cases and across time. This is just a quick map showing the countries that we cover in the report. We cover 17 European parties. This is partly to do with what the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung was interested in. So some countries are not there, like the Netherlands, but we will, of course, be happy to discuss this in more detail. So just to give you an idea here about the rise in the countries that we've looked at. Overall, as you can see, the rise of the far right has indeed taken place. That's the black line on the bottom. And interestingly enough, it has coincided with the decline of both the left and the right mainstream parties. Now, you might tell me again, if you recall the map, you might tell me, but but in Greece, the Golden Dawn actually now is in prison and they're not the decline. Or what constitutes rise? Look at the AFD. If a party gets 7% of the vote, is that a rise? Is that success? So I just want to quickly here highlight that we identify 3 types of success. In other words, success can be seen in 3 ways. First, indeed, the percentage of votes. So many of these parties have increased their support. So that is in itself quite important. You can see the Fratelli d'Italia, for example, recently, or the Sweden Democrat. But this is not the only indicator of success, because yes, indeed, some of these parties have declined or are fluctuating. More importantly, a second indication of success is the so-called breakdown of the cordon sanitaire. So what is striking is that these parties are now increasingly entering mainstream ground. They are no longer ostracized in the political system. In Sweden, we were considering having the Sweden Democrats support a minority government. In many countries, these parties, the other parties in the system are thinking, oh, in order to address the far right, we need to imitate the far right, we need to copy their policies. This is, I think, a stronger indication of success. Third, of course, again, as part of that, many of these parties are entering government. We're hearing more and more of far right parties or right-wing populist parties being in government, in office, either alone or as coalition partners. This is much more so than before. So while votes in themselves don't necessarily indicate a rise, we can see that the bigger picture does indeed suggest a breakdown of the ostracization or marginalization of the far right and what we call the mainstreamization of these parties. But let's look a little bit into different patterns as well. Where do they stand? I should say here that that we don't have the latest, the Swedish and the Italian elections which just happened, because this came out last spring. But you can still place it a bit in the context. So this is here, Western Europe. You could see, as I said earlier, fluctuation. But what the dominant part of this pattern is that although these parties do go up and down a little bit, we do have striking success of the AfD, the first far-right party to enter the Bundestag in Germany. We also have, yes, UKIP has now imploded, but indeed it has influenced in many ways the way that mainstream parties in the UK have behaved. See Brexit. We also what happened with the Rassemblement National in France in the latest election. So generally in Western Europe, we have formerly niche parties entering slowly mainstream ground. Now, in the Nordics and the Baltics, which is another sort of area that we will be discussing, again, you can see variation, but also increasingly a striking decline of the Othon sanitarium. Again, in terms of votes, they are fluctuating, but in terms of the mainstreamization of their discourse, we see this quite a lot. In Southern Europe, my home, again, a very interesting phenomenon here. What we saw is with the eruption of the economic crisis, the rise of the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn, so quite different type of party from the rest of Europe. And yet now this is in prison. In other countries of Southern Europe, like Spain, for example, Cyprus and Portugal, we didn't have the far right at the same time, but now as the far right in Greece has been probably, let's say, subsumed by the mainstream in many ways, you do see the rise in Spain, you see it in Portugal, and of course Italy, which I didn't mention, is interesting. In our report we cover Lega, and now it's Fratelli d'Italia. So you see that again, it's still the far right, this volatility in among voters, but it's still the far right. People are not; these parties are not stigmatized. People will happily vote for them. And in Central and Eastern Europe, I know we'll hear more about that later. You have a very different pattern. Again, what you have is formerly mainstream, even liberal parties radicalizing slowly in government, right? And so in a way you have the opposite pattern, the opposite phenomenon of these parties starting off as more liberal and progressing closer into the far right territory, sometimes overtaking and substituting the existing far right party, like what happened between Fidesz and Giudici. So why? This is the bigger picture. It's mixed, as I said. Why? We all want to know, and that's why you're all here in this room tonight. Why is this happening? Well, the conventional wisdom that we hear, both among academic circles, but also in the media, is that it's some kind of cultural backlash. People are sick and tired of immigration, right? And therefore, they are protesting, they're angry, they don't want this cultural erosion in their society, so they are voting for the far right. Why? How do these theories know that? How do these people know that? Well, they know that because immigration is a salient issue. If you look at things like Eurobarometer, if you ask people, what's your issue? It's immigrants, immigration is the problem. We know because in many surveys, we see a lot of the people who are classic profile of far-right voter, and they have authoritarian values, and there is an increasing identification along the axis. So in other words, there is, according to much of this literature, a new socio-cultural cleavage between the, how did they put it, the somewheres and the nowheres. You will tell us how we can.
Thank you very much, Daphne. Thank you, Othon and colleagues, for joining this event. And we, in the report, try and challenge this conventional wisdom in a number of ways. So I suppose our starting point is that we think it's correct to emphasize that for this rise to happen, to be successful, you need a meeting of a high demand for a particular kind of ideology, meeting palatable supply, party appeal, mobilizing these sorts of grievances. So this is where we agree. However, we challenge the conventional wisdom on three fronts. So on the people front, what's often done in political science is that they typically run statistical models looking at the predictive power of particular kinds of characteristics. So for instance, if I asked Hartmut, what do you think about immigration on a scale from 0 to 10, and he says, it's a 7, and I do that for thousands of people, I can then model the probability that different people vote for a particular far-right party. Typically, when you do this, and I know that Hartmut ranks low in terms of opposition to immigration, so I'm not trying to put him on the spot here. But typically, when you do this, you find that opposition to immigration, opposition to ethnic diversity is highly predictive of a vote for these kinds of parties. And you see it in all sorts of studies, all sorts of countries, all sorts of time periods. And from there on, the inference is, therefore, the explanation of the rising support is the characteristic that is highly predictive of the vote. The problem with that, of course, is how many people have this characteristic in the first place. So you could imagine that you have some people who are perhaps highly racist, but they might not be the majority of the population. And so if you're thinking about the rise of a far-right party IP that goes to 20, 30, 40%, you have a problem here, right? So point number one, predictive power is not equal to substantive importance. You need to think about the size of different groups and the motivations that lead different kinds of groups in the electorate to vote for these parties. On the party level, you then need to think, why is it, therefore, that people who are not necessarily scoring very highly on anti-immigration attitudes turn to these parties, right? And we think that the explanation, paradoxically, is not that this party are especially extremists, they are, but is that they have tried to repackage themselves in a more civic, nationalist, more radical rather than extremist ways, distancing themselves, at least in rhetoric, from the neo-Nazi or neo-fascist links, trying to say this is not us, we're purging ourselves to some extent, at least in terms of the appeal, or descriptively, how far they are from that. And they combine this more civic nationalist rhetoric with an appeal to welfare chauvinism that picks up not just to your position to particular groups, but to protection. We will protect you, and we will protect you also about on insecurity. Last but not least, this then opens up the possibility that it's not just about party position, very well emphasized, or electoral systems, very well emphasized. It's not just about particular kinds of grievances in the population that are exogenously given this sort of arise from crisis and other things. It's also about the policy response. And this is something that's often not really discussed in our view, what and how policies shape the grievances and insecurities that people feel and make them feel, protected or listened to, and how that mediates the link between particular kinds of shocks and risks and voting behavior. The way we do that in the report is threefold. Partly we draw from some of our research, as Daphne mentioned early on. Partly we do some bespoke analysis of the European Social Survey, looking at the 17 countries that we mentioned on the map early on, over a period of 9 waves, from 2002 to 2018. And we also looked at party manifestos to try and map the position of different parties on these indices. But as we all know, party manifestos are not perfect. And so we also have a series of comparative case studies in the report. Maybe this is a good time to mention that we have a bunch of free copies if you're filling a thirst for more of it by the end of this, which maybe you won't, but if you do, there are some copies here. And last but not least, we try and model the probability that different risk groups vote for far-right parties as a function of the policy environment. And we draw to some extent here also causal work that's been done elsewhere in the literature. So what do we find here when you see colors that indicate statistical significance, when you see gray that indicates that nothing is significantly related? If it's orange, it has a positive association, and if it's purple, that is indeed purple, then that indicates a negative association. So here we're modeling the prediction of a particular individual in the survey, about 100 to 200. I think it's about 200,000 respondents across these 17 countries I just mentioned. And we're saying what makes you more or less likely to vote for far-right parties. This is often done in literature. And we find that men are more likely to vote for far-right parties. We find that people who are older up to a certain point are more likely to vote for far-right parties. People with low to medium level of education is more likely. Interestingly enough, as an average across the whole sample, being in the bottom part of the income distribution makes you less likely, so it's not a pure income, objective income insecurity effect. Occupations and sources of income here, not many significant effect. Next slide, please. And then you can think of occupations as well in which you work, low-skilled occupations, agricultural workers, craft workers, and operators, people with routinized, low-skilled tasks in the case of operators, more specific skills in the case of craft workers are more likely to vote for far-right parties. In terms of location, being in urban areas, less likely, but makes sense because these are often the places that draw more. And then you get the usual findings about immigration concerns. Now here, crucially, I just stop to emphasize that it's not just cultural concerns about immigration that make you more likely to vote for far-right. It's also, and independently, also economic concerns about immigrations that might tie to things that have nothing to do with any cultural aversion per se to immigration. Euroscepticism, trust in the European Parliament makes you less likely to vote. Authoritarianism, having authoritarian attitudes, more likely to vote. And then you have religious practice, interestingly. Here, the more often you practice, the more likely you are to vote, but that varies a lot across countries. I should say here, this overall picture actually changes country by country, and you can find that more in the report. Now here you find a different way of looking at this that shows you a little bit how the predicted probability itself changes. These look like small numbers, but remember across the 17 countries across the entire time period, we're talking 2-3% average support for the far right. So going from 1.5 to 3, when it's significant, it's a doubling. And in certain countries, the effects are much larger, obviously. So age, you can see, up to a point increases your probability. After 54, it stops. Males, 2.8% versus 2% for females. Urban, 2.2% versus 2.6% for rural. I don't mean to bother you too much with the details, but these magnitudes are actually not insignificant if you think in the percentage change in the predicted probability. They're quite important. Next slide, please. Here you see the well-known picture that attitudes also matter a lot. Very authoritarian people much more likely to vote for the far right, and having low trust in the European Parliament, but you see that also for other markers of trust institutions, makes you more likely also to vote for far right parties. Now we come to immigration attitudes, right? Here you say, as I was saying before, you can see that when you have more concerns of an economic and cultural kind about immigration, you tend to be highly likely to vote for far right. You can see here that the magnitudes of the effects between a very cosmopolitan, let's call them a cosmopolitan person here with very low concerns, almost 1%, 0% probability of voting for far right. It overlaps a little bit, actually, if you look at the confidence intervals. And if you go to higher level, you have a tripling, quadrupling the probability, right? So it is true indeed, but predictive power of immigration attitudes, anti-immigration attitudes, is very important. However, note the relevance of partisanship, continuing relevance. I mean, there's a lot of talk in bits of the media elsewhere about taking from the left, but in reality, if you look at self-identification, whether people think of themselves as the left, is still very much the case as a broad average in Europe, but people who self-identify as being left-wing are highly unlikely to vote for. Now, as I was saying before, the thing that's often conflated here is that it does not follow from predictive power that you have a phenomenon which is explained primarily or exclusively based on cultural concerns over immigration. Let me just show you the graph here. That shows a combination of economic concerns about immigration, very high to very low, and then the movement up and down the curves is about cultural concerns over immigration. Here what you see is that, yes, cultural concerns highly predictive, but economic concerns are not irrelevant at all either, right? So you cannot infer from this claim that cultural concerns or that concerns about immigration matter. You can't infer that it's a purely cultural phenomenon. The more important point here, if you move from predictive power to distribution of characteristics, if you look within the right-wing populist electorate, who declares that they have concerns high or low about different kinds of concerns about immigration, pardon me, you see that in a lot of countries, you have a good 20 to sometimes even 60% with no concerns about immigration. And actually, even in countries where you do have concerns about immigration, it's a combination of economic and cultural concerns. So it is not the case that the majority of the people who are in far-right party electorates are, primarily exclusively motivated by cultural concerns over immigration. In fact, if you look at the most successful parties, the ones that have increased their score, they have done so by reaching other groups which are not typically far-right party supporters.
Super. So if you had one takeaway point from what all the demand side slides that Tim just showed you, it's this, right? That the far-right electorate is very, very diverse. It's not just about some people who have cultural insecurities and that's it. It is a very diverse pool. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of variation across countries, but the main point is that essentially there are people with cultural concerns that vote for the far right. These are the core constituency. They tend to be a smaller group. There are people with economic concerns about immigration that vote for the far right. These are peripheral voters and a larger group. Even beyond that, 1/3 of the far right electorate has no immigration concerns at all. Right? There are indeed some people who vote for the far right that have no immigration concerns. What does that mean? That means that the reason why far right parties are successful is not just cultural insecurity, but rather the ability to appeal to a broad range of voters, to forge a coalition of voters with different concerns. And how do far right parties do that? They do that through their supply. So moving on to our supply side analysis, where we looked at Marquardt data, examining party manifestos, but also read the manifestos ourselves to look at the sort of individual case nuances. We basically, as Tim said in the beginning, find that most of these parties tend to be part of the radical, if you like, rather than the extreme. The Golden Dawn, for example, is an aberration to this rule. These parties have managed to appeal to a very broad electorate, to go way beyond their secure voting base by putting forward nationalist solutions to all socioeconomic problems. So what's your problem? The NHS is not working properly? Get the immigrants out. What about you? Are you concerned about education? Get the immigrants out. And what might your concern be? No problem. The solution is get the immigrants out. So whatever the problem, they propose a national solution. This is how we distinguish between far-right parties and other parties in the system, in that far-right parties use nationalism not just as a part of their rhetoric, but rather as the key policy proposal for every social problem. To look at that, as I said, we looked at these, we looked at the party manifestos, and we did find indeed that looking, for example, at emphasizing the national way of life, that is very, very important. So nationalism is indeed a key aspect of these parties' manifestos, but you can see that it's a bit different here when we make interesting distinctions between Eastern or Central-East versus Western Europe. Now, again, what I should say, based on the more qualitative analysis of the manifestos, is that the Western European parties are more emphatic with their civic nationalist narrative. So they try to distance themselves from ascriptive criteria such as race or things that we're born with, and they say that, we exclude people on the basis of their ideology because their ideology is intolerant to our liberal democratic values. Look at the, even beyond the report, look at the Swiss SVP, with its big campaign, the white sheep, black sheep on the Swiss flag, but the way they justify that is the black sheep is the deviant sheep. So they try to steer away from a racial kind of justification, saying that they are illiberal, they are terrorists, they don't espouse our values. In Central Eastern Europe, it's a little bit different because they still emphasize some of the more ascriptive or ethnic criteria. They're also, I should have said, Eurosceptic. Again, you can see here how multiculturalism is quite different between Eastern and Western European far-right parties and the trajectory that these parties have been taken. And you can see also that there was a big change in the extent to which they're becoming progressively right-wing. Now, what about their economic policy? As we said, so on the one hand, these parties put forward nationalist solution to socioeconomic problems, but at the same time, they link that to a type of welfare chauvinism. And so it's really interesting because we as academics will have these big arguments about cultural reasons versus economic reasons, but these parties have noted that a lot of voters have economic concerns, and therefore they really emphasize the welfare state, and they emphasize economic insecurity in their own narrative. So you can see here, for example, how their support for the free market has declined, both in Eastern and Western Europe across time. There are obviously, if we look at individual cases, some fluctuations, but basically these parties have departed from the winning formula of the free market to become more and more welfare chauvinist, right? And they support welfare expansion, although again, there is a difference between East and West.
Someone could open the door to create a bit of a draft. And that'd be very much welcome. Just a tiny bit. Yeah, exactly. Just okay. We've talked about the individual level predictors. We've talked a bit about what's going on the supply side in terms of the party positioning. Let me just say a few brief words about policies before we wrap up. I think the first thing to say, and that's often not emphasized, although it's very well known in political economy, is that there's been a very strongly downward secular stagnation. I mean, it was celebrated by the recent Nobel Prize in the early 2000s that finally we had managed the economy well, and there was great moderation in terms of inflation, but it was also a great moderation in terms of the growth paths of advanced economies. And you see that here, obviously, there's changes over time for this average of 36 advanced economies. You have recessions and all the rest of it, but if you abstract from cyclical changes over time, on average, it's gone downwards very clearly. At the same time, you've had a stagnation in the 1990s of social expenditures, which was a bit arrested in its movement by the great financial crisis in 2008. So you see it goes back up, but to a large extent, if you compare that to needs, actually, in a lot of ways, it hasn't kept up. And hasn't kept up in two ways that have been discussed quite prominently in CP literature. One is the growing liberalization of labor markets, right? We reduce protection on permanent workers. We make it easier to hire and fire workers on permanent contracts at the same time as we open up all sorts of avenues for employers to hire people on more temporary contracts, and even there you see liberalization. So that means that people who are in work are experiencing growing insecurity in their perception of the risks of losing their job relative to the unemployment level that they find in the labor market. At the same time, yes, social transfers, it's the retrenchment is the dog that didn't bark in a sense, but actually it did if you think of the needs basis, right? So yes, transfers continue to go up, expenditures continue to go up, but relative to the aging of the population and the massification of unemployment labor markets, and people who are outside of the labor market as well, who are, in a way, would be counted as unemployed, but no longer are, you see this so-called needs gap widening. And even in countries like the Scandinavian countries, it's being eroded at the margins, the protections have been eroded, people who receive things and benefits are being activated, there's more conditionality being imposed on them. And why does that matter? That matters because actually, aside from our own research, there's a great deal of increasingly causally identified research demonstrating the causal effect of various forms of economic insecurity. So you have some good work on automation, on debt, on your own unemployment, but even parental unemployment, on the impact of company layoffs, on imports, linking these to insecurity that was relatively well established, but also linking this increasingly to far-right voting. And indeed, then cutting both recently, you see in the UK case and Brexit, it's the FETSA 2019 article, but also Hart's reforms, there's some good work showing that they also increased the AfD work. And even going back to the 1930s, there's some emerging work showing that the austerity patterns were correlated with support for the Nazi Party. So there's all sorts of emerging, very recent, last 2-3 years literature, showing that actually policy cuts and austerity lead to higher far-right party support. And what we do in the report, which is a bit more correlational to make the point, is we say, look, if you think of different kinds of risks that you can be exposed to, unemployment, being sick, or perhaps, I mean, this is not totally a risk, but having more children, which exposes you to greater probabilities of poverty. This is something from the social policy literature. And if you map the probability that these people vote for the far right, what you find is that people who are in these risk groups in places where the benefit system is not very protective are much more likely to vote for far right parties than in cases where they are. Now, this is not to say, by the way, that this is the only thing that matters, and therefore, if benefits are high, no problem, no one votes for the far right, right? This is to say that the probability that a particular risk group, the effect of that being in that risk group on the probability, that is moderated by the welfare state benefits, right? So it's a kind of effects of a cause rather than causes of an effect kind of thing, and we can discuss this more in the journey. Okay, next. Okay, to conclude, because I'm aware of time and there's some discussants as well after me, we see the contribution of this report as having a twofold structure. On the one side, we bring together our arguments about the fact that successful foreign parties are not successful because suddenly you have massively higher cultural issues. They're successful because they're able to aggregate and coalesce different groups with different kinds of grievances successfully. And they do so by changing the supply in a way that makes them acceptable to people who are not the traditional constituency, right? So in a sense, the cultural backlash thesis, you could almost say, is getting it backwards, right? Because it's not that you have greater cultural concerns and then these parties become more culturally opposed. It's actually, in some sense, not completely the opposite, but it's actually that they're able to bring other people with other kinds of concerns into the fore. Policy implication, cooptation doesn't work. So for the left to just start adopting the far right party position is not working. This is us, but it's not just us. There's a lot of other really good causal work in the last 2-3 years that has looked at this. And in fact, it's not even clear from the flows, the voter flows you see, that most of the far right electorate comes from people who self-identify as left-wing or who were primarily left-wing. There is some leakage, obviously, but this is not the main part of the story. Instead, maybe the left should focus on these issues, on these grievances, some of them genuine, that people have that lead them to vote for far right. Thank you for bearing with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for presenting so much information. There is also a lot of it, apart from the 3 Ps that they identified, people, party politics, policies. They also have the individual cases as well examined in there. So it's a really great work. And thank you, Tim, for restricting yourself to the time that you set for the panel in the first place. Okay, so now let's continue with our first discussant, Lenka.
Okay. So it's great pleasure to be here. I have been reading your works for years, and I look forward to reading your work as well. And so this is it's a great opportunity to be here together and think about one of the most pressing issues that contemporary democracies face. So this is a wonderful cross-national study. A lot has been said. I would say 3 issues really stand out. What I love about the study is its emphasis on the study of policies, and especially as the right-wing parties enter governments, form coalitions, and shape policies, we see that the proof is really in the pudding. Manifestos are great, and promises are great, but you really see what these parties are doing to address inequality and hardship, and some of them are actually, especially in Eastern Europe, are doing quite a bit, and I will come back to it. So I think this is the study of policies has been neglected for a long time. I mean, partly because they were not in power, but I think that's that really was very appealing in the study. As was already said, the study has a lot of surprising findings. If you have followed their work, you would have known that one of the main findings is that the right-wing populist voters perhaps do not care that much about immigration, and the sub-finding is that the culture-oriented right-wing populists are rare and constitute a minority of the electorate. So this is really, that goes against the predominant ideological view of right-wing polarization voting. And there are very important policy implications, and I will start with them and then I will come back to it at the end. And the policy implication that that the study addresses is that should liberal, cosmopolitan, progressive left parties try to steal immigration issues as a cultural issue, but try to steal immigration as a divisive issue? And the answer is absolutely not. It will not lure in the electorate, stick to, traditional issues of inequality, protection, and security. So that's, that's a very serious policy implication of the study. So now let me put on my East European hat and talk about progressives a little bit in Eastern Europe and whether this really important policy recommendation travels. And I know that the policy recommendation is very narrow, so the objective of the study is not to have a cookbook how to curb right-wing populism, but ultimately that's what we are after. So progressives in Eastern Europe are on life support. I wanted to sort of, in my early notes, I wanted to write they're dead, but then I was reminded of Slovenia, and so they're not dead. And so there are a couple of issues. Progressives, or what you would call progressives in Eastern Europe, do not own economic inequality. They own multiculturalism, but they committed an original sin in the 1990s, which is that they were associated with neoliberal reforms. They were in coalitions and they spearheaded some of these reforms. You cite an article that we published. We had an anniversary issue in Eastern European politics on Ben Stanley and Stanley Bill. It was crazy too. They have this wonderful piece on Poland which talks about this original sin. And even if the progressives today try to run away and become more Western, the illiberals will remind them very well of what was done in the 1990s, and nothing is forgiven. So it is unlikely that the right-wing populism will be stopped by progressives, even though that's not what you recommend. But populists actually, and this was also in the presentation, they have been recently dislocated in Slovenia, but in Slovenia Democratic Party lost by Svoboda progressives. In Slovakia, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic, they were dislocated by various coalitions. And in my view, if there is any way to curb the sort of very extremist wings of right-wing populism, it will be done by socially conservative mainstream right-wing parties or Western-oriented Christian democratic parties. In other words, by more moderate cousins that I think can have the ability to tame them a little bit. And I'm originally from the Czech Republic, so you probably know what I'm referring to. So the big really issue when we think about how to address the issues of inequality and redistribution is really who owns this issue. So I don't know who owns this in the West, and I'm not sure if progressives really own it, but that would be another debate. But in Eastern Europe, the right-wing parties, with some variations, so the Baltics are sort of different. The right-wing parties, the far-right parties, have always been economically on the left. They have always sensed, this has been a revolt. This is as much as a revolt against ethnicity, multiculturalism, but this is also a revolt against the 1990s and the reforms, which brought good things, but also the bad things. So let me go back to the beginning after, because I think ultimately, these results are wonderful, but I think ultimately this piece is very ambitious and really trying to think about strategies and how to address this. And I really appreciate the recommendation is just don't stick to your own guns and don't be tempted, because I think most parties today are tempted to go on the pathway of culture fronts. So let me just talk briefly about 3 issues that I think if there was a publication 2.0. So this publication already is a wonderful comparative study, and I cannot emphasize how difficult it is to study the Europe broadly defined together. Most people, stick to their little Eastern Europe and they stick to their, other parts. So this is really bold and, so much called for and appreciated. And there is a valuable distinction between cultural, economic, and mixed, sort of ways to think about immigration and policies and scarcity. So I think, but we can all keep unpacking. I just moved, so I'm thinking about unpacking all the time. So if there was a 2.0, what would I unpack again as an Eastern European? So I would unpack 3 things: immigration, social conservatism, and babies or birth rates. So what is, let me go briefly through all of this and then I will come back to policies. So what is immigration? What is it that, when surveys ask about immigration, what is it that people are afraid, and what is the link to economic insecurity? And I really think it's important to think about the relationship between ethnic appeals and appeals based on social conservatism. Are they substitutes? Are they fungible? What is the dynamic between them? Can you just drop ethnicity and become anti-gay and ride a wave, or what's going on? We very often think, and I have been guilty in my own work, to think about social conservatism as an afterthought of homogeneity and associated with authoritarianism, which you pick up quite a bit in your study. But I think authoritarianism and social conservatism, we should think about it separately, and then we can think about how they can come together. And then I would like to because we all want to, I think, come back to policies and how to think about this as a smart strategic way. I want to talk about policies that relate to demographic anxieties and birth rates in Eastern Europe. Many of you know that Eastern Europe is the fastest dying region on the planet these days. So anti-immigration. So what is it that if I was living in the Czech Republic and someone asked me anti-immigration mobilization, I would be, there are many ways I could have answered the question, or a lot of people in Eastern Europe. So number one, immigrant is a ghost. So Eastern Europe discovered Syrian refugees and threat of immigration. So some of the fear is linked to the migration crisis in 2015, 2016, which anti-immigration attitudes again discovered. This was really from the top down. There's a lot of studies on media framing that show how nasty and insane this process was, and how basically politicians really created this new threat. And of course, it's linked to perceptions of EU being incompetent in terms of not being able to handle the crisis. A lot of it is linked to dissatisfaction with Angela Merkel's policies vis-a-vis the resettlement and anti-German sentiments, and a strong sense that Germany, especially after 2014, doesn't have sovereignty interests on all these countries in mind, which, as we know today, is true. So what is, so number one is a ghost of us that, every reasonable Syrian Muslim would never settle in Eastern Europe. So, okay, it's a ghost, but it's an important ghost. However, if you look at, so number two, there are actually a lot of migrants in Eastern Europe, especially after 2014, 2004, and I'll come back to 2022 very briefly. If you look at census data, and I just did a study of Czech Republic, it will blow your mind. So these countries, some of them, they're very homogeneous, but it's changing quite a bit. So there are a lot of Ukrainian workers, there are a lot of workers from the European peripheries, a lot of Chinese workers. There was a mass wave of after Yugoslavia. There is zero mobilization on this. There is no politicization of the fact that these countries are changing in front of our eyes. Orban, Kaczynski, and Babiš are importing migrants left and right because there are serious labor shortages, and there are no babies, but especially labor shortages. So at the one hand, you run these very strong anti-immigrant campaigns. On the one hand, you are importing labor left and right, and then okay, I'll just leave it at that. So there are a lot of immigrants, but nobody cares. And as the chip far-right party said, like, Ukraine works fine. We are culturally compatible, we want that. But I'm not sure if it's about race or not. Then, and something that's mentioned in the study, there's also immigration tied to Russians and in Slovenia to ex-Yugoslavia. So that's another possibility. And of course, we should all think about the fact that one of the strongest right-wing populist party in Europe, launches this party and absolutely opened the doors to Ukrainian refugees, and the country is doing an absolute, a phenomenal, fantastic job in taking them in and helping refugees as much as we can. So that sort of brings me to the second point about social conservatism. We can debate this in the Q&A, but I would submit that, in my view, the Hungarian rise to power, the Fidesz and Long Justice Party, came to power because they allied with the churches, and they called it social conservative law. We published, they used the Syrians, they a little bit of anti-Semitism, a little bit of gays, fine. But fundamentally, this is about social conservatism. We published a phenomenal study by Bela Griskovits about civic circles, about the rise of Orban to power in 2010. He worked very hard. We basically used middle class church groups, and that was his pathway to power. And similarly, I would sort of suggest that the Polish case, the pathway to power for the One Justice Party is not through ethnicity, but through social conservatism and religion. Moreover, we see, this is really social conservatism is not is happening in heterogeneous countries as well. So a lot of parties actually now are discovering religion, LGBTQ, gender inequality, and the religion in your findings, religion actually plays quite a prominent role in support of these parties. So in Slovakia, there are most of the new parties, they run anti-gay and family issues. Similar in Romania, heterogeneous, the same. The ECRA, the Estonian party, is actually now pro-Russian, but appeals to Russians on socially conservative issues. The Ukrainian far-right party also discovered anti-gay. And then if you see innovation in Eastern Europe, you don't see it on ethnicity. You always see it on family values. So Confederacja in Poland, Smerodina in Slovakia, it's all about traditional families and values. And then, going back, parties innovate all the time. So ECRA in 2021 in Estonia was actually fined by the Electoral Commission for using Russian billboards because they quoted Russian voters on social conservatism. So a complete flip, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of innovation. I think most of the innovation is around social conservatism. And then why this might be the case, or how would we think about it in terms of policies and economic ties? And so I think what you mentioned in your studies is there is a lot of effort by a lot of parties to promote nativist policies, to stop the to stop the replacement that can either happen through robots or immigration, and to address massive labor shortages that are, again, due to immigration to the West or very low fertility rates. And then when you think about, there are many ways why LGBTQ and gender, is being attacked. If you read very famous Orban speech on illiberalism, it's basically like going back to Polanyi and Durkheim. He talks about destruction of bonds of solidarity, need to live in communities that are infused with reciprocity. And so one way to induce reciprocity, is a type of a welfare state when families can do a lot of the work. You don't have to buy stuff you don't have to go on the free market. Your families, your community will help you, protect you from hardship. And very often you pay, lower, you don't have to pay the market price. So in Eastern Europe, there's still a lot of gray market when instead of hiring something to do something, you rely on your neighbor. You need a tree to remove from your forest, so a neighbor will do it for you. So there is still and this reciprocity is not only wonderful, but really shields against hardship. So that might be an economic impetus for going after groups that erode communal solidarity, which is gays, women who want to work, and people who move around all the time and they are dislocated. There are many reasons to do it, but I think that this might be one way to think about it. Now, finally, I want to make one point about unpacking welfare policies. Welfare policies are very diverse in different countries. So Dorota Shikra, when she describes the Hungarian case, which is very neoliberal, exploits workers like crazy, low wages, low wages everywhere. But she talks about the Hungarian model as a welfare for the rich. A lot of nativist policies actually target middle and upper middle class families, of course, of the right ethnicity. And that's a certain type of welfare where everything falls apart, but there are these targeted opportunities. In Poland, the One Justice Party did a phenomenal job in poverty alleviation. It runs the largest child poverty reduction program. Maybe this is before they lock them in. Maybe they need one more election, then they drop everything and back to the Hungarian model. But right now they are really addressing poverty, and that's how they're targeting and buying of voters. in general, a lot of populists are in power now, and that brings me to the concluding remark. And we see that they use the power of the purse very, very efficiently. But they target voters, they very carefully, they identify pockets of voters, pensioners, people in rural areas. There's like a lot of evidence that COVID help was targeted to loyalists, pro-nativist policies against, but targeting nativist policies very specifically. So in Hungary, you can get a loan, but if you get divorced, you have to get the loan back. So there are a lot of strings attached. And so they really, this is going to be a very uphill battle over who owns social welfare protection, because the populist parties have done a fantastic job in, at least on the surface, addressing some of these, talking about it, sometimes addressing it, sometimes not, but they are really, ahead in this race. And so, good luck. But I think they're on the right path, that economic insecurity is at the core of this multifaceted coalition. But they noticed this 10, 15 years ago already. So thank you for a wonderful study.
Thank you, Lenka. We did a fantastic job of the discussant as well, so well done. Anja, 10 minutes for you, and then we can open it for
Stop.
Q&A.
I'll be too long. Cut me short.
Okay, I'll show you the time.
So I've tried to, first of all, I would say read the report. It's really a really interesting study. It's quite long, but still it's worth the time. Can you hear me in the back? Very much. So they managed to condense an amazing amount of information, I think, in this report, and still it is very consistent. There's a consistent framework. It's well structured, it's well readable, and I think even it has a specific framework and a specific aim, it does give like an overview of the far right in Europe more generally, which is very well appreciated. And I think it's amazing that they managed to do these two things, which they also discussed today. So on the one hand, they have this part where they try to understand right-wing populism as a phenomenon, and then they have these three parts, people parties, policies, and at the same time they have this thoughtful discussion about what does it mean, what should we do about it, and which integrates much of the new, very recent literature in the field. And I think personally I find the argument very convincing, that where they slice the electorate in the way that they presented in these two groups, one group that is smaller but cares a lot about cultural issues, and a bigger group that cares more about economic issues. And I think there have been in the last few years, maybe many people have made very good normative arguments for why progressive parties should not copycat the far right. And you make like a very good, I think, empirical argument on why that should, from an empirical standpoint, should be the case. I've prepared 3 questions and comments, some of which echo what Lenka said, and it's things that I reflect some of the issues I have encountered in my own work and don't address in the report, and I would be curious about how that resonates. So the disclaimer, as already been said, I've worked mainly on the Western European far right, and I had this project on how far right parties and far right groups have engaged with education after 1945. So my first comment is about your understanding of the phenomenal right-wing populism. The report is labeled Understanding Right-Wing Populism. However, the report actually has a specific view on right-wing populism as a kind of ideology that is carried by parties. So the main focus of actors is parties. There's an argument in the recent literature, I'm thinking about Castelli-Gattinara and Piero, but others have done that say that actually right-wing populists should be considered as a social movement in a way. That would mean that parties are only like a small part or one element within a larger constellation of actors that are trying to push this ideology in society and in politics. And these authors actually argue that it's a specific feature of the far right or right-wing populism, because they were so isolated in the past, that they have created this kind of very strategic job sharing between partisan and non-partisan actors, where the latter, so non-partisan actors, actually are attributed a very important role in mobilizing the streets, or in pushing certain narratives in the media. So since the far right adopt this kind of Gramscian metapolitic view. And in my own work, I've seen this unfolding in education. So education is not something that the far right is used to put on their manifestos, but still, if you read like the internal literature and the things they produce, it's actually something that they consider crucial on the one hand to mobilize certain types of voters, especially women, teachers, students, but also as a key institution that should be changed if we want to produce like larger social change in society. And there is this idea that institutional change cannot be generated exclusively from above, so from parliament, but you have to mobilize the ground to actually change things. So both, just to cite the most well-known examples, both the old Movimento Sociale Italiano, so the predecessors of Fratelli d'Italia, and the Othon Nationale, since the beginning, they developed like a whole network of association and organization around the party itself, which included a teacher union, a parent organization, mothers organization, which were meant to mobilize women around educational issues, student unions, and so on. All were part of this far-right constellation of actors. And they even organized education themselves. So they had schools, some of them were like were preparing future leaders, but some of them were targeting older chunk of population. And I think we see similar networks and kind of mobilization attempts emerging today. Think about the protests against sex education in Germany, in France, and in other countries where actually far right has collaborated with migrant organizations mobilizing against sex ed in schools. There's the Rassemblement National as formed a teacher union, as we wide the teacher union, and it's not independent, kind of promises to teachers higher pay in her last campaign. And outside Europe, so in the US, we see right now this kind of movement again to occupy school boards and local elections in order to. And I'm wondering if we are to consider right-wing populism as part of the social broader or this broader social movement, rather than just looking at the parties. How would this impact on your analysis, both in terms of like right-wing mobilization platforms, but also on the recommendations you would make to progressive parties? So how important do you think are like more targeted efforts at mobilizing specific electorate research that Lenka mentioned might be another way in explaining different professional or socioeconomic mobilization patterns that you find across countries? So that would be the if you think about mobilization patterns and explaining the right, how important are these kind of street, Pegida in Germany, this kind of more movement-like mobilization attempt. And my second question then, which would depend on your answer on how important that is for mobilization, is how should progressive parties and actors then engage with that part of right-wing mobilization? Should they engage with it? And if yes, how should they engage with it? So it seems like the right is investing a lot of time in or a lot of energy in mobilizing outside the parliamentary arena. Does the left or progressive need to follow suit and kind of also have this kind of mobilization way of mobilizing the ground to counter this attempt? There have been a few successful attempts of doing so. I think the Sardinian in Italy would be one. The democratic movement in the US is trying to do something similar. I'm not sure whether these groups are actually pushing economic concerns in the way you say, or whether they're more on a cultural, try to mobilize the culture. But yeah, I would wonder how the recommendation resonate with that, especially considering that the far right or right-wing populism has links to specific groups also in outside the parliamentary arena, which are often very violent and extremist. So how should the left or progressive groups also deal with that, with the fact that partners of the far right, of right-wing populism, actually include groups that are violent, that are anti-democratic? And I think that will become even more relevant now that many of these groups have moved to Russia, and if Russia becomes a kind of pariah state, what should we do? Should we treat the far right as a kind of regular party family actor, or put the left change that? My second comment is more in the nature of your recommendation and their implications for what I would call day-to-day politics. I read your recommendation as rather election focused. I might be wrong. So you are saying if progressive parties want to win the election, they should consider
And considering voters' current attitudes, they should focus more on like economic equality issues, something they own and many voters care about. However, politics does not only happen during elections and party manifestos, that's what Antony also said, and people's attitudes are not fixed, meaning that what should progressive actors of parties do when the far right is successful in framing issues in cultural terms in the public. You have this fascinating discussion on migration as a kind of issue that is both cultural and economic. But there are other issues, I think, that where you could apply the same reasoning. One of them, being in the university, would be higher education. So, the expansion of higher education has often been framed as a social policy or an economic project in a way, and far right is now trying very prominently to frame it as a kind of indoctrination project, thanks by left-wing activists that are trying to indoctrinate our kids. So your recommendation to progressive parties is try downplay this kind of cultural issue and engage more with what you are where you own an issue, so on with the economic part of the agenda. But what should they do when things are already there on the agenda, when cultural issues are already there? And I'm Swiss, every like few months I vote on the far right project, so someone has to deal with that in a way, with the fact that now we have to vote on whether to, I don't know, banning minarets and mandating national anthems in schools. Someone has to engage with these issues in some way. And I have a last one. I'll be right with you. My last point is about the social policy part. So the report describes most parties as having still a rather blurred social and economic policy agenda. However, we also show, I think, this kind of trajectory that has been a general move towards more pro-welfare stances. And I think some parties, including some that you described in the report, Lenka also said that actually embraced rather expensive equality focus, also welfare understanding, and that also you can also see from their education projects. So they actually embrace the kind of policies that much of the literature would describe as like traditionally left ways of approaching education and welfare. So the Front National moved from like support for vouchers in education to support for expanding primary education and a very standardized primary education system. Fratelli d'Italia is promising huge financial benefits for young family, comprehensive and free childcare, and so on. So these are huge projects, and in a way they combine the kind of national rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric, as is that, with this kind of very expensive left-wing economic policy. So here, my question would be, how convincing is it then? Your recommendation would be for progressive parties to engage more with the economic issue, but if this far-right party shift to the left in a way on these economic issues, how convincing is that if then you don't have nothing to, like you're proposing the same kind of policies that the right would be packaging in a like nationalist discourse, and you're packaging non-nationalist discourse. How convincing is that program? How sure are you that voters would prefer a kind of left-wing narrative about the expansion of the welfare state as compared to a right-wing, more kind of strengthening the tradition?
Thank you very much, Anja, for your. Can I ask two speakers to respond for 2 minutes, or would you like to go to? Okay, let's open.